for me, the question I've been grappling with, not just in Wales, but in England as well, is actually how do we transform our school systems for the better? You know, for a lot of years I've written about, seems like many years I've written about, I'm actually younger than I look. For many years I've written about school improvement and argued, you know, very vociferously that, you know, we can improve schools and the sort of levers that we can pull to improve schools. But I've come to the conclusion that actually the school is the wrong unit of change. Because we can improve individual schools, but that can often be disconnected. And it can be partial or temporal. And I think that actually the system should be the unit of change. Because how often have we seen schools improve? Sometimes initiatives come in, schools improve, and then they return to normative practice. So I'm firmly of the belief, and I think this is why the work in Wales is so important to me, that the system should be the unit of change, rather than the individual schools. That doesn't mean the individual schools are not important, but they're part of the system, as is the district, as is the national level. However, if we look around the world, you know, we see not just initiative overload, but we see what Payne calls so much reform, so little change. In other words, we've become obsessed with the process of reform and the absorption of initiatives, but yet we've not asked the question, well, are these the right initiatives and will they make a difference to the right things? And the right things meaning what happens in classrooms. And one of the sort of failures, it seems to me, of a lot of the reform is about what Payne calls the inability for adults to cooperate with one another. So much of staff development is premised on this sort of modelling, that I have the expertise, and here I am to deliver and transmit to you all the expertise. And we know that this is the least effective form of professional development there is, okay? Yes? Thank you, I'll leave now. It's the least effective because all the research evidence would show that if you've been listening to me, you've probably been listening to me for about 10 or 20% of your time, okay? If you were undergraduates, which I'm looking around the room, I think you're not. I'm just getting my own back now, okay? The remainder of the 80% of your time, you'll be thinking about sex. But I'm confident, looking around this room, that is not the case. So if this is the least effective form of professional development, the question is, well, what is the most effective form of professional development then? What could we do that would really make a difference to the classroom? If this is the least effective form, what is the most effective form? So my question to you is, what is the most effective form of professional development that we have? Each other, absolutely. It's as complex and simple as saying it's when teachers work together on issues of instruction with a focus on learning outcomes. That's what makes the difference. That's where the powerhouse is. And that's why networks and professional learning communities are so powerful, because they actually encapsulate teachers' collaboration focused on instruction, linked to learning outcomes, and working together and sharing best practice and knowledge. You know, if we go back to the Ontario example, I'm not going to labour this and hold it up as an exemplar, because I think there are some issues with it, but let's just sort of stay with it for a moment. And I've talked about the few goals, but it seems to me that what they did in Ontario was to recognise not just that teachers have the expertise, but that putting teachers together in communities of practice was actually a really rather good thing to do if they were serious about raising achievement. Also, there was very much attention to focus staff development. Now, some of you will have heard me say this before, but I get asked to do a lot of staff development events in schools. Do you have those? Are they compulsory here? Yeah, we call them inset training or something back in England and Wales. Anyway, I get asked to do some of those, and I'm always reminded of the staff development prayer that goes like this: Lord, if I die, let it be on a staff development day, where the distinction between life and death is imperceptible. Now, I think I think I've probably been on a few of those days. I may have even delivered a few of those days. But you know what I mean. So if we continue to do our staff development like that, we continue to get the results that we get. So we have to think differently about changing teachers' practice. We have to think differently about those forms of staff development that do make a difference. Hence, professional learning communities. To distill it down to its bare essence, if you look at all the effective school improvement initiatives across the world, it comes down to three things and three things only. An absolute focus on learning outcomes, not teaching, but learning outcomes. A focus on changing teachers' practice, what they do in classrooms. And finally, and thirdly, a focus on collaborative ways of working. Now, there are many, many school improvement programs, initiatives who have not made a difference, primarily and exclusively because they haven't focused on those three things. So if you're going to take anything away from the broader literature on school improvement and say, what three things should we be doing then in order to raise achievement and attainment, it's those three things. A relentless focus on learning outcomes, an absolute conviction in terms of changing teachers' behaviors and practices, and a focus on working together. And by working together, I don't mean the sort of group work where you work as individuals, okay? I don't mean what Andy Hargreaves calls contrived collegiality, which is roughly working with people you don't like but pretending that you do. It's actually saying, what's the most important priority in this school? What's getting in the way of learning? And how do we collaborate? How do we inquire to solve that problem? And what expertise can we bring to bear on that issue or that problem? If I can take you to Compton School. Compton School is in London. It was a failing school, but now is very much a success story. And I went into Compton School and just asked the question, you know, what did the school actually do to achieve this success? Was it some initiative? Was it some sort of directive from government? Was it just a passionate or charismatic head teacher? Well, no, it wasn't that, actually. What the school talked about, the people in the school talked about, was this notion of the constant reinvention. In other words, there was a restlessness, even when they were performing at the highest level, to reinvent themselves, to push the boundaries, to do more. A recognition that school improvement is not an event, but it actually is a process. And therefore you have to constantly engage with that process. It becomes the cultural norm, the way we do things around here. And this notion that people are your only asset. You know, Microsoft say people are your best asset. Well, yes, but actually in a school, people, whether they're little people or big people, are your best asset. So how do you build powerful relationships? I also like this, because I often get told by schools and by teachers, well, there's too much change. If they just stopped all the change, then we could get on with the job. But actually, you know, if things stop changing, there's only one end product, and that is they die. So change is not necessarily a bad thing. But the pace of change, if it's too fast, will make teachers feel demoralized. If it's too slow, then teachers will feel that actually progress isn't being made. So there's a balance between both challenge and support, but also the pace of change. So what are the implications of that? What am I actually saying? Well, the first is that, you know, in England we talk about best practice, you know? Well, I don't think there is really best practice. There isn't no perfect practice. There's just emerging practice. And I like to think of, you know, not just what is the best practice, but what is the next practice? How do we generate new knowledge, not recycle old knowledge? And there's something about the appropriateness of practice in context as well. I talked about the importance of leadership in context, but it's also the appropriateness of practice in context with your kids in your setting. What I'm coming to is this notion that if you distill it all down, the answer does not lie outside the school system, or indeed outside schools themselves. You know, millions of pounds have been spent on, you know, educational consultants who've done very little to change systems or to change schools. My basic argument is the answer lies within. But what we need to do is to find ways of untapping that, find ways of actually putting teachers together so that we develop next practice, that we actually move beyond the recycled knowledge to new knowledge. Okay, I've talked about high trust already, but I think it's really important to underline that, because whether they're network learning communities or whether they're professional learning communities, and quite frankly, I don't care what we call them as long as we're clear about the practices that make a difference. There has to be high levels of trust. And I think we've probably got one attempt at moving forward in a collaborative way. And if there isn't high trust, then that will soon erode. And we also need, and as I said earlier about the Google model, we also need high creativity and high energy within our schools and our school systems. Okay. This is the McKinsey report, which basically argues that the best school systems come out on top because of two things. They focus very much on the improvement of instruction, improvement of teaching and learning. And they also focus primarily on changing individuals' teaching practice, okay? Do you remember, I don't know if this will translate at all, do you remember the Colgate ring of confidence? Hands up those people who do. Right, for those people who don't, which is majority, this will make no sense at all. But Colgate toothpaste had an advert where you had a ring of confidence if you used the toothpaste. Well, I think we all stand within a ring of competence. There are certain things we do really well, and we're very comfortable in our little ring of competence. But what we're asking teachers to do, if we're going to ask them to change their practice, is actually to step outside that and to take a risk. So they can only do it in a situation of high trust. So we need to get teachers to step outside their comfort zone. And I often get asked the question, how do we engage those teachers that are disengaged? How do we engage those teachers in the staff room who've retired but haven't told us? Now, I know you're thinking of someone right now. Interestingly enough, if you feel vulnerable as a teacher, if you feel unskilled, there is a tendency to go into sort of retrenchment. So one of the things we perhaps should be doing with those teachers who've retired and haven't told us is trying to engage them in this sort of work. Because potentially, then, they're A, secure, and B, they have the opportunity to observe other practices. One of my great claims to fame is I did a study in England of ineffective subject departments in secondary schools. Right? Ineffective subject departments in secondary schools. Now, can you imagine being a researcher saying, you seem to be highly ineffective. Can I possibly spend some time finding out why you're so bad? Doesn't win you many friends, okay? But what's interesting, I did look at departmental effectiveness, and I did have the opportunity to look at some of these departments. And one of the things that was absolutely clear is it wasn't the case that there were weak or poor teachers in these departments. It was a case there was an absence, a complete absence of high-quality professional practice. So they wanted to get better, but they didn't know how. There were no models there for them to look at. Does that make sense? The other thing was that I talked to the heads of these subject areas, and it was the first time that anyone had sat down and actually spoken to them about what they were doing. So many years on from Judith Warren Little's The Privatization of Practice, we're still there in some degree. And we have to break down those barriers so teachers do feel comfortable to talk about their practice with one another. Not all teachers are fortunate enough to be in a network like this, or networks like these. There's still that sense of, I close my classroom door. The problem is the ineffective teacher closes the classroom door, and has a direct impact on kids over a long period of time. So we have to change that. So let me talk about professional learning communities. It is clear from the research evidence that it isn't just about teachers collaborating. You know, in England we had an initiative called Network Learning Communities. And schools were encouraged to participate in these network learning communities. And the incentive for doing so, I'm going to translate it into dollars, was around $100,000 per school. Would you be interested? So some schools, some principals were really clever. They were part of more than one community and laughed all the way to the bank. The problem was these networks were operating, but they were empty networks. There was nothing that they were actually sharing that was meaningful and useful because the driver was the wrong driver. The driver was financial, yeah? Net result of that investment, maybe £6 million worth of taxpayers' money, was no impact on the classroom, no legacy, and a tendency to feel that networking hadn't worked. So my argument is that actually if we need, and you may disagree with me, but if we're going to really network purposefully between schools and change teachers' professional practice, we've got to look within schools first and get the skills of collaboration going within schools before we can network across schools. So we can share meaningful practice, not recycle old practice. Does that make sense? Yeah? Because I don't think networking is terribly easy if it's there to change teachers' practice. If it's there for social reasons, it's dead easy. But if it's there to actually change what happens in the classroom, then we have to really be skilled at the collaborative ways of working.